Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for another LinkedIn broadcast, this time on red flags for exporting to certain countries in the Caucasus and Central Asia. We decided to pick up this topic because we've seen so many information and news on sanctions evasion, especially to Russia, since the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. A lot of sanctions have been imposed against Russia by the US and the European Union and other Western allies. And these countries that are former Soviet countries and countries neighboring Russia have come to the spotlight because regulators are concerned that some items and shipments might end up in Russia that are not actually meant to end up in Russia. So sanctions circumvention and sanctions evasion has become a huge topic in the past couple of weeks, and you probably saw a lot of guidance documents being published by regulators on this topic. And the last package of EU sanctions also included a new mechanism for the EU to target parties which contribute to sanctions evasion, EU sanctions evasion. So let's begin with the presentation. Today, we will do a quick recap of the news that I have observed in the past couple of weeks. Then we look at some export statistics, which will demonstrate the crazy increase of exports to countries neighboring Russia and their exports of high tech to Russia. We will look at the geography around Russia, sanctions evasion using 2 case studies, and then at the end finish the presentation with the red flags and certain questions that you should ask yourself if you are exporting to those countries. So let's look at the news that we have seen in the past couple of weeks. I found a couple of really good documentaries that were published by Deutsche Welle, a German media outlet. 2 really good documentaries which you could watch as well. One of them called Western Military Components for Russia. The other one, Failed EU Sanctions, where they go to the border in Georgia and just interview people and analyze the situation on the ground and check if sanctions are actually being respected by those countries neighboring Russia. Furthermore, you had news showing that countries such as Armenia and Kazakhstan are exporting a lot of high tech to Russia, and that EU regulators and also EU member states are putting more pressure on those countries to respect EU sanctions and US sanctions, of course. Let's have a look at Russia's neighbors that I wanted to focus on today. I want to mention that in the title I mentioned a couple of countries, but the Russia sanctions circumvention methods are being used not only through those countries, but also other countries. So don't focus specifically on the countries, but just the methods and the case studies and the red flags that we discussed today apply to any of your transactions. It could also be used to hide transactions or exports going through other countries such as Turkey, Azerbaijan, China, Hong Kong, any country that is bordering Russia. Let's have a look at the export statistics. Exports to Russia from countries such as the US, the UK, the European Union, Japan, and China. As you can see on this graph, direct sales of Western goods and technology have actually plummeted since February 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine. Basically, through sanctions and export controls prohibiting the exports of energy, chemicals, raw materials, manufactured goods, machinery and transport equipment, and many other products. So now we will look at some other graphs, namely exports from the EU and the UK to Caucasus and Central Asian countries. A clear rise that we can see right after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So customs records and trade data reveal a massive spike in imports by Russia's neighbors of dual-use technology that is restricted under US and EU sanctions. As you can see here, the highest increase of EU and UK exports went to Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Georgia, and of course a dip of exports to Russia since February 2022. And another graph demonstrating Caucasus and Central Asian countries' exports to Russia. A dramatic increase also at the same time from countries such as Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Georgia to Russia. So the former Soviet Union countries increased exports of goods to Russia immediately after the beginning of the military operation in Ukraine. So no surprise, the Federal Customs Service of Russia and the Bank of Russia stopped publishing export and import statistics to conceal the amount of goods imported from those countries. However, we can still find information on these numbers because Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Armenia continue to disclose data on their trade with Russia. So these three graphs demonstrate that there has been a huge decline of exports by the US and EU and Western allies to Russia of high tech, and a huge increase suddenly to countries bordering Russia, and also a huge increase of trade between these countries and Russia. Let's zoom in a little bit on the exports of dual-use goods from Kazakhstan. Importing goods globally increased massively in 2022. Imports from the EU for computers, processors, or integrated circuits increased up to tenfold compared to the previous year. And then the exports to Russia, highlighted in red here, you can see they increased more than tenfold in certain cases. A good example is the increase of computers and related parts at the top, which went from only $127,000 in 2021 to almost $300 million in 2022. Now let's have a look at similar data for Kyrgyzstan. Similar trajectories here. Kyrgyzstan suddenly imported much more products from everyone around the world. Also from the EU, a huge increase, as you can see here, in aircraft, helicopter, and UAV parts from $0 to $612,000, and exported those goods to Russia from $0 to suddenly 1.6 million worth of products. Kyrgyzstan did not import or export a single part of airplanes, helicopters, or drones in 2021, but in 2022, Kyrgyz firms imported 3.5 million in such parts, primarily from the United States, and exported 1.5 million in this category to Russia. Okay, this was basically statistics showing you the reality, what is happening right now. And obviously, the EU and the US started to put pressure on those countries to close off those products and those exports to Russia, because those exports are actually restricted. Let's look at two case studies that demonstrate how these exports or transactions could actually happen and what you should pay attention to. In this case, let's have a look at some ghost exports to Kyrgyzstan. On the map on the right side, you can see the small country of Kyrgyzstan, south of Kazakhstan, circled in green, and Russia to the north of it. The case is as follows. So, a Bishkek-based company called RM Design and Development orders analog devices amplifiers in the US. It's a company in the US. And Bishkek is the capital of Kyrgyzstan. The customs papers state that the final destination is Kyrgyzstan. RM, the company in Kyrgyzstan, pays for the logistics and for the goods. The goods are only meant to transit through Russia. The bank paying for the items is in Kyrgyzstan, and all the persons involved are not sanctioned. On paper, Russia is just a transit country. But suddenly the items end up in a warehouse in Russia without going to the final destination in Bishkek. RM shipped the items to the Russian company Microporibor, which supplies electronics to the Russian state entities in the defense sector. So this is just an example how a transaction or an export of certain items, which is meant to go to Kyrgyzstan, never ends up in its final destination in Bishkek. Russia is just a transit country in this case, but the items are being offloaded in Russia and actually redirected to the Russian customer. So if you look at the transaction, you wouldn't see anyone involved in Russia except for Russia being the transit country, which is possible for a lot of exports. So this case demonstrates how goods can be retransferred without ending up in the final destination. Let's look at another case where we look at the Kazakh firm with Russian roots. On the map to your right side, you can see Kazakhstan, and to the north of it, Russia, with two companies interacting in this case study. The Kazakh company called LM Group orders electronics in the EU. LM Group was incorporated on March 14th, 2022, and has no website. Remember that Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. So this company has been incorporated right after Russia's invasion. And having no website, there's no information on that company, which is strange because most companies that are doing legitimate business have an online presence. You never received orders from this company, especially not for dual-use goods. You look deeper into the ownership structure of LM Group and you find out that it is owned by a Russian businessman called Kirill Tulyakov, who also founded a company called Streloi e-commerce in Russia. The owner is suddenly sanctioned and the ownership of LM Group in Kazakhstan is suddenly transferred to a Kazakh lawyer named Maksat Atikov. So this case demonstrates that you need to do your due diligence. Because this company has been just incorporated, it didn't exist before. There's no online presence, which doesn't provide you with a lot of information on that company, and it's difficult to do due diligence. And you find out that the ownership structure changed right after the Russian owner of the company transferred the ownership rights to a person who is not sanctioned and who is in Kazakhstan. Okay, let's move a bit closer towards the red flags that I want to discuss with you today. Before that, I just wanted to show you this procurement cycle. The procurement cycle here illustrates the different stages and types of entities likely used to acquire goods. Not all stages may be used in every procurement attempt. But in this case, the end user typically uses the two intermediaries in the middle in the red box to cover or front the request for the goods to conceal the intermediary, to conceal the end user. So the true end users of the procured goods are unlikely to approach international suppliers directly or be named as end users on paperwork. Instead, organizations often use a layered approach to conceal their procurement activities. In this case, an intermediary or a front company. A front company is an entity acting entirely on behalf of the sanctioned entity, and the business may be registered in another country on another name, but they still might be linked. So you need to do proper due diligence. Now let's go to a couple of red flags that I summarized in 3 categories. First of all, a couple of questions that you can ask yourself when it comes to your customers, when it comes to the product that you're shipping, and also the country or the end destination that is stated on the papers. Let's go quickly through a couple of questions that you should ask yourself, which can indicate red flags. First of all, on the customer side, as we have seen in case 2, it was a completely new customer. So ask yourself, is the new customer a completely new customer in your system and is ordering goods that are dual use or military? That's a huge red flag. Has the company been recently incorporated? So you check the website and the company has just been established. That could also be an indication for a front company. Is it a subsidiary of a Russian company? If you do your due diligence, you might find out that the owner of the Kazakh or Georgian or Armenian company already owns a company that is related to Russia's defense industry based in Russia. Has this company had any previous dealings with an SDN? Was maybe a previous owner listed in the US or the EU, or is still listed, but moved his ownership to another person? And does the customer provide vague details, especially about the end user and the end use, and is reluctant to complete an end use form? That's a red flag as well. Or the payment comes from a third-party country or business that is not listed on the end use statements. Now, if we look at the product, you might ask yourself, does the transaction concern sanctioned, dual-use, proliferation-sensitive, or military goods? Then it's very sensitive and you should do proper due diligence. Can you observe a dramatic increase in new orders for items the customer didn't previously order? So you might have had customers in those countries before, but suddenly these customers are ordering goods that they didn't order before and goods in high amounts. We have seen in the news that suddenly countries such as Armenia and Georgia saw a huge increase in imports of wash machines and cars, which could end up in Russia, because it's highly unlikely that those economies are just growing massively and those products are used for domestic consumption. Or does the customer decline installation, training, or maintenance of the purchased items? Let's assume you have a very advanced machine and you usually always send people to install the machine. And your customer in one of those countries doesn't want any of your employees to come to the location and actually maintain and install the machine. That could also be a red flag and indicate that the final end use might not be the one that you are expecting or you have in your papers. Or is the customer significantly overpaying for the items and offering a lot of money for something that would usually be less expensive? Or proposes to pay in a currency that is other than the US dollar? Now, if we look at the last category, the country category, you might ask yourself, is it a shipment that previously would have been destined for Russia or Belarus, but is now destined for a country without restrictions? So you might have had customers in Russia before the sanctions, and now the same orders for the same orders for the same amount of goods, the same prices, are suddenly being ordered from those countries that are neighboring Russia. It might indicate that the Russian company opened another branch in one of those countries and tries to procure the same goods through another country. Or is the shipment inconsistent with normal geographic trade patterns? For example, is Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan suddenly a new transit point for your shipment to somewhere else? IP addresses that do not correspond to reported location data. Your customer might say that he's located in Armenia, but if you check and screen for the IP address, it is actually an address in Russia. Or is the country of the stated end user the same as where the order was placed from? I hope these red flags just give you an idea how you could approach your export transactions. I found a lot of valuable guidance documents online, and we still see a lot of guidance coming. Even today, I've seen a new guidance document being published, and I just want you to give a bit of information where you can find more information on these red flags. Before that, I wanted to remind you that this is a free resource we have on the ACSS website, our Anti-Circumvention Resources Hub, which provides you information on anti-circumvention regulations, guidance documents, and FAQs, and red flags as well, published by the EU, the UK, the US, and other government resources. So please visit our website if you want to know more about our anti-circumvention hub. And all this information that I discussed today can be also found there. Here's an overview of some of the most important sources I used for today's presentation. All these guidance documents can be found on our resources hub. Today, I saw a very, very good guidance being published by, I believe, the Lithuanian Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I included it here in the list. It's the second one, called Detecting and Preventing Sanctions Evasion and Circumvention in Trade, Practical Guidance for Economic Operators. They list very good red flags that I also just went through. So please ask me on LinkedIn for the presentation or the links, and I will share them with you. I would also like to remind everyone who is a CSS member that you can access your webinar archives and rewatch webinars that we did in the past on sanction circumvention. For example, in April this year, we did a webinar called Preventing and Detecting Circumvention of EU Trade Restrictions via Third Countries. So you can go into your ACSS resources and rewatch the webinars, not only this one, but many more webinars, for free. And last but not least, I wanted to share a couple of webinars that are coming up that we planned for ACSS members, and some also free webinars, such as the next one on the 20th of July, this week, Thursday, A Needle in a Haystack, Best Practices Identifying Sanction Securities. On July the 27th, we look at UK sanctions, look back at what happened in the past 6 months. And on the 7th of September, we will look at EU and UK ownership and control. So please register for our upcoming webinars and visit our website for all this information that I discussed today. Now is the time to receive a couple of questions. So please submit your questions on LinkedIn, and I should see them coming in through LinkedIn and read them out loud and hopefully be able to answer some of your questions. Thank you a lot. Thanks a lot for joining me today for this broadcast. I hope it was helpful to give you an idea what we are experiencing at the moment, especially with transactions to post-Soviet countries in the Caucasus and Central Asia. And let me know in the comments how you liked the webinar and what I should discuss next during a future broadcast, and what other topics that are really interesting to you. And we will try to cover them in our next LinkedIn broadcasts. I will now receive your questions if there are any. Otherwise, I hope you have a great start into the week and hopefully see you next Monday.